Hello everybody, it's Richard Clark again, and this is the third video in the series on addiction, social history of addiction, the persecution of addicts and alcoholics by society, by religious organizations, and by politicians. And that misunderstanding of addiction and persecution has been going on for about 180 years. And I wanted to talk about the misunderstandings of society and towards addicts and alcoholics in general, which is why I wrote the two books that are behind me on my left. The first one is Spiritual Transformation. It's the third edition, and it explores in depth a lot of the ideas that are ineffective in helping people recover from addictions. It talks about a gentler view of spirituality, the more correct ways that where prayer can be successful, and it's sort of designed for people who want to tone down their religious outlook on life and participate in a sort of a more deist approach to life, where they recognize that there is some kind of an undefinable higher power and they wish to have that higher power participate in their life. The second book, the blue one, is the Addiction Recovery Handbook. It's the revised second edition. And that's the book that prompted Terry Wood from the Easy Does It Club of Surrey, that prompted Terry to invite me to do this seminar series. Over the last year or so, Terry and I have been involved in quite a few conversations about the meaning of the book and what's to be gained by understanding the content of the book. Terry is the education coordinator of the Easy Does It Club in Surrey. And so he asked me if I would present this series of videos, probably 15 or 16 videos of about 15 minutes each, cover the history of addiction, definitions of addiction, what a spiritual lifestyle is, some of the important side issues to addiction recovery, to talk about why there's a high failure rate when people are discharged from treatment. The failure rate's about 90 or 95%. And what we can do about that. So there's a lot of social analysis and understanding of addiction from a social point of view, and a psychology of addiction that is put into the blue book. And what dawned on me after I had written it and got some feedback from people is that if you're a deist and you want a quiet outlook on the views of life that involved some kind of a higher power, the green book might be for you. And if you're interested in an agnostic or an atheist approach to recovery and what those alternatives are, then you would be interested in the blue book. And of course, from my point of view, if you're interested in studying and learning about the complete breadth and depth of addiction in this modern society, of course, up to me, you should buy both of them and read them both carefully. A friend of mine a little while ago made a comment that if you were to buy the books and carefully study them to learn about addictions, you're looking at 5 years' work. That was an observation that he made. In any event, the green one is Spiritual Transformation. The blue one is the Addiction Recovery Handbook. They're written by me. I think I used my full name on the title. It's Richard W. Clark. And they're available on Amazon.ca, Amazon.com, or you can buy them through the publisher's website, which is friesenpress.com. In British Columbia. It's on Vancouver Island in Victoria. So anyway, thank you to Terry for inviting me to do this. And if I think of it at the end of this seminar, I'll hold up a little card. I'll do it now. This is the websites where you can get in touch with Terry Wood, which is easydoesitclub.org. He's the education coordinator. Or you can get in touch with me, Richard Clark, at greenroomlectures.ca. Either one of those websites, you can track us down. So anyway, what started this was a number of conversations I had with clients of mine. I've been an addictions therapist and counselor now for, I think, 37 years. And I've participated in my own personal recovery consistently and successfully for 42 years. What prompted the writing of the books, which is what I encountered in conversation with clients and people in recovery, is the massive amount of confusion about what addiction is. Is it an illness? Is it a disease? Is it a function of sort of moral failure and sinning, which was presented by Bill Wilson in his book Alcoholics Anonymous? And it's complicated. As I've said before, and I must say again, I've been studying this sincerely and thoroughly for over 40 years. And every time I thought that I had figured it out, something else would come to mind, and I'd think, oh, well, that's a part of the addiction equation, and I got to learn about that. And then I'd figure that out, and I'd have to go back to the beginning and start over because I'd discover something else that I had not understood as a part of the equation. So understanding addiction is a very complicated thing. And if you really wish to understand it, it's going to take you a long time of careful research and meditation. And hopefully either the green book or the blue book will contribute to that and sort of cut short your inquiry. Now, a lot of this misunderstanding, as I've said over the last 2 or 3 videos, a lot of the misunderstanding has come from a lot of the chaos and confusion that came to a kind of a head in the 1920s in the United States. We had the temperance movement from 1840, which viewed drinking of any description of any amount as sinning, and if you were a drinker, you were a moral failure, moral turpitude, and you had to adopt the evangelical Protestant-Christian view of sin, fall on your knees and pray, and seek forgiveness from God. That was the temperance movement's presentation of drinking. And then we had the opium crisis that was in the United States from about 1860 on, certainly in Canada and Britain. The opium crisis that was involved in society from about 1860 on, where by 1900 or so, we had over 10 million Americans that were addicted to laudanum, which was a combination of alcohol and powdered opium. And I talked a lot about that before. And then we have Prohibition that comes in 1920, and Prohibition piggybacked in to the social consciousness and the political movements of the early 20th century. It piggybacked in because of its association with the suffragettes. The suffragettes, of course, were a large group of women that were seeking the vote for women so that they could participate in what political party was governing their lives. And because there was a lot of women in the temperance movement that were also involved in the suffragette movement, the morality, which is questionable in the temperance movement, it's questionable to assume that anybody who drinks alcohol is a sinner. That questionable morality gained some credence and some value because of its association with the suffragette movement trying to get women to vote. And I mean, certainly trying to get women to vote was legitimate, valuable, it was overdue, and everybody that had any kind amount of a social awareness or education understood that women getting the vote was only a matter of time. It was inevitable. And so the temperance movement got a little bit of political credibility because it piggybacked along with the suffragettes. Now, that left us with this confluence of social issues in 1920 with Prohibition. What we had, because of the change in laws in the United States where laudanum became illegal and unavailable, was that around 1918 or 1919, we had 10 million people who were opium addicts from laudanum that were wandering around the community trying to find some substitute drug for the opium that the government had taken away from them. And so with Prohibition and the creation of speakeasies, which were available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, largely under the table by word of mouth, and there was a lot of sort of tongue-in-cheek approval of speakeasies by the powers that be. It was easy for people to obtain alcohol in speakeasies. And as we all know from the addiction substitution schemes, where people will quit drinking and they'll start smoking twice as much, or people will quit smoking and drinking and they'll start watching pornography, or they'll quit drinking and they'll start spending and buying and spending and buying and going bankrupt. The thing to remember is that when you're dealing with someone who is an addict, and they say that they're an alcoholic or a drug addict or a gambling addict, whatever they say, a sex addict, there's always 2 or 3 addictions operating in the background. And anybody who says they're an addict must understand, and I really mean that, they must understand that they are not a single case addict. It's polyaddictions. And so what we have is 10 million people, 6 million of whom are women, wandering around mostly the east coast of the United States looking for some kind of a substitute addiction. And in 1920, with the birth of speakeasies, we have this immediately available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week access to alcohol. Now, what was surprising to some social researchers is what they discovered in the first 6 months or a year of Prohibition. About 90 or 95% of the customers in speakeasies were men. And it was only 4 or 5% of the customers in speakeasies that were women. And by 1921, after Prohibition had been in full swing for a while, what we realized was that about 40% or 45% of the customers in speakeasies were women. And of course, anybody who's drank alcohol to any extent understands that when you're drinking alcohol, you're less inhibited about your sexuality. It's easier to act out sexually. And so with the 40% of the population or clients of speakeasies being women, it's easier for people to find sexual partners when they're feeling a little bit less constrained because of their alcohol consumption. And of course, what happened at the same time was Henry Ford and his assembly line construction of complicated machinery, which means a lot of people had access to cars, especially middle class or upper middle class people, wealthy people who had access to a disposable income had cars. And when you had cars and you could go to speakeasies and you had a lower sort of standard of sexual behavior, then it was easy to understand how vehicles, which were enclosed, had windows, could protect you from inclement weather, were largely private, were easily converted to portable bedrooms. So people who were in speakeasies and wanted to act out sexually could go out to the car, drive a half a mile to a secluded spot, and act out in their portable bedroom. Now, that changed a lot of things in American culture. And what it did was, because women were now seen as drinking more, and people in general were acting out sexually more, and we had the temperance movement's view from 1840, the previous 80 years. They had the temperance movement's view that if you drank, you were a sinner. The morality of the United States came to exist that if you drank, you were a sinner. And there was something morally reprehensible about it. And that view of sinning if you drank, and certainly sinning if you were acting out sexually or having premarital sex, if you became pregnant when you weren't married, if you got a divorce, all of these things, which were aspects of heavy alcohol consumption in portable bedrooms in vehicles and persecution of society in general by the temperance movement, all of this gave us the idea that we were sinners. And so it created a perception of recovery from alcoholism that required there be some sort of atonement for the sinning of alcoholism. And what we have is the way that Alcoholics Anonymous came together in 1935, Founders Day is June 10, 1935. The way that it came together between Bill Wilson and Bob Smith is there was a definite tone of moral failure in the process of being an alcoholic. Now, this was made worse by the advent of the Oxford groups. So what happened was we had this guy named Frank Buckman, who was an evangelical Protestant minister from the United States. He was in England in 1908, and he witnessed in a Chautauqua tent in England, he witnessed an evangelical woman Protestant minister who gave him what he called his conversion experience. And Frank Buckman came to realize in 1908 that his mission in life was to create a Christian world that was absent of sinning. And so he created his Oxford group. It didn't really have a name for the first 10 years or so. He created this group of people that were committed to sort of creating and outlining a way for everyone in society to seek forgiveness from God and become good moral Christians. And if you were a good moral Christian, then you were a good member of society. And of course, what that meant was that whatever he determined, Frank Buckman determined as sinning, which was pretty wide, he thought that premarital sex was sinning, he thought that homosexuality was sinning, he thought that pickpockets and gamblers and people who drank and drug addicts and junkies and petty thieves and major criminals and troublemakers in general and people who didn't go to church, all of these people were sinners. And if you wish to find Christian salvation in the Protestant movement, then you could join the Oxford group, and if you confessed your sins and surrendered to God and made sort of restitution to everybody and participated in Christian religious services, then you were saved. So all sinners were welcome, and alcoholics were just sort of one small category of everyone that Frank Buckman thought was a sinner. It's only a small category. The thing to remember is that there are very, very specific and available writings about Frank Buckman that make two things perfectly clear. He was notorious for being irresponsible and undependable regarding appointments. He would frequently and very often show up late or not show up at all, and he would make excuses for himself that he was late or didn't show up for various appointments or meetings because that's what God wanted him to do. So Frank Buckman was very clear that because he thought he was this sort of advanced Christian, that anything he did was God's will being directed at him. And there is some evidence in writings that Frank Buckman was inordinately obsessed with sexuality and young men. And there are records of him being asked to leave college campuses. There are records of him being excused from offering seminars and lectures because of his suspicious sexual behavior in wanting to closely examine the sexual habits and behaviors of young men. Now, I'm quite certain from the reading that I've been able to do that if you can take that kind of behavior and put it into 2015 or 2020, we would have a very sort of a cynical, disapproving view of Frank Buckman's more or less obsession with sex and young men. So it's important to remember that Bill Wilson and Bob Smith grew up in this mess. They grew up in the idea that drinking was a sin because Bill Wilson was born in 1895 and Bob Smith was born in 1879. And so they were born into and raised in a culture where the temperance movement was prominent, drinking was seen as a sin, the only acceptable solution to Protestant-Christian society was to drink nothing at all. The suffragette movement was in vogue by 1900 or 1910, where in 1910, Bill Wilson would have been something around 15 or 16, and Bob Smith would have been something around 26 or 27. So both of these men were raised with this sort of Christian focus of the views of alcoholism and suffragettes, and they were raised in the Jazz Age, where there was an awful lot of loose morality and drinking and irresponsibility, and of course both of them had drinking problems that became evident after the First World War into the 1920s. And so Bill Wilson ends up going to Towns Hospital several times in the early 1930s, where he met Dr. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth was of the opinion, or he developed the opinion from some background research that had been done by other doctors. He became of the opinion, especially from Benjamin Rush and a guy named Thomas Trotter and Dr. Huss from Sweden. Dr. Silkworth presented the idea to his patients at Towns Hospital that alcoholism was actually a disease. It was an allergy to alcohol. And the only thing he knew what to do was to somehow get people to quit drinking, to swear off, because of his Silkworth's focus that alcoholism was actually the manifestation of an allergy to alcohol. And while that was going on, and Bill Wilson was in Towns Hospital and being treated by Silkworth, he was sort of absorbing the idea that alcoholism was an illness or a disease. In sort of late 1934, early 1935, Bill Wilson was approached by a man who was a major contributor and a major participant in the Oxford group in New York. And this man met Bill Wilson and started talking to him about the evangelical Protestant perspective of the Oxford group and how this man, had got sober and surrendered to God and said his prayers recently or regularly and had become a good Christian. And it was presented to Bill Wilson that this was probably a good thing for Bill Wilson to do. So through the early 1930s and into 1935, Bill Wilson was presented with two ideas. One of them from Silkworth, that his alcoholism was an allergic reaction to alcohol and a disease, and from this fellow from the Oxford group, that if he surrendered to God and turned his life over and prayed and sought forgiveness, all of the tenets of the Oxford group, that he might maintain some sobriety. So Bill Wilson struggled with this, and then in somewhere around sort of April 1935, Bill Wilson ends up on a business trip, goes to Akron, Ohio, and through a very circuitous route, he ends up meeting Bob Smith, who is a proctologist, a doctor in Akron, Ohio. Bob Smith had been struggling with his own brand of repetitious drunkenness, destroying his life, being an out-of-control alcoholic, and through his wife and a couple of women friends of hers, Bob Smith had been attending the Akron, Ohio group of Oxford group. And so Bill Wilson goes to Akron. He decides he wants to find another alcoholic to tell his story to so that he can maintain his sobriety. He meets Dr. Bob Smith. These two guys get together and they have a big conversation in a meeting about discussing how to stay sober and the crippling effect of alcoholism on their lives. And Bill Wilson presents the medical aspect that it's a disease, and Bob Smith is well indoctrinated into the Oxford groups. And so between the two of them, Bill Wilson manages to convince Dr. Bob Smith that staying sober is worth it, and Founders Day of Alcoholics Anonymous is June 10, 1935. So, with these influences, Bill Wilson helps Bob Smith start a recovery group based on the Oxford group approach in Akron. And Bill Wilson goes back to New York, maintains his sobriety. He starts finding a few people that he wants to get sober. And in that first year and a half, he manages to stay sober. And then, as a result of some influence from an associate of his named Hank Parkhurst, Bill Wilson decides to write a book of his journey from alcoholism to sobriety and recovery. And after he's sober about 2 years, he starts writing what we now call Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book. So remember that at 2 years or 2.5 years sober, according to today's standards, Bill Wilson still would have been a newcomer. And he's trying to explain his process of getting recovered from his own brand of alcoholism. So, in this writing, he's trying to blend together in some sort of reasonable presentation that most people can understand 3 things. The morality of the temperance movement, which he was born and raised in, where drinking is a sin, and in order to be a good member of society, you must be a good Protestant-Christian, and so you must seek forgiveness because that deals with the sort of moral turpitude of alcohol consumption. And then, from Dr. Silkworth, he has 2 things to include in the book. One of them is Silkworth's idea that there's an allergy to alcohol, which is a disease, and once you drink alcohol, this mental obsession component kicks in, which is the illness part. So Bill Wilson, in writing this book, is trying to join together in a way that makes sense the moral turpitude of the temperance movement, the disease aspect that alcoholics are allergic to alcohol, and the illness aspect that there's some kind of an obsessive compulsion to drink, an obsession that gets started up when you do drink. Now, all of this was partly Bill Wilson talking about his own white light experience, which he had in Towns Hospital. And you have to remember that when he was in Towns Hospital, Bill Wilson was under the care of Dr. Silkworth, and he was being administered morphine as a sedative. He was being administered psychoactive drugs, which changed the way he thought, and he was being administered under a doctor's care belladonna, which is a hallucinogen. A belladonna was a really early form of, it's kind of like associated to LSD, which was discovered many more years earlier than it was popular. So Bill Wilson, in the hospital, detoxing from alcoholism, is being given belladonna, a hallucinogen. He's been given psychoactive drugs, which changes the way he thinks, and he's been given morphine. Then, while he's under the influence of these 3 heavy drugs, he has this white light experience, which is probably a psychiatric reaction to the drug intake, but Bill Wilson defines it as a white light experience that converts him to a faith in God. Now, there is some evidence in Bill's writing to indicate that he struggled with this, and he struggled with sex addiction, smoking addiction, and various other things for the rest of his life. And so there's a lot of suspicion and controversy around those first few years of Alcoholics Anonymous and Bill Wilson's use of drugs. I mean, it's known that he participated in LSD experiments in 1958 with people like Aldous Huxley. And so all of these things are kind of left out of the general conversation about Alcoholics Anonymous, because some people will think that that negates the credibility of AA, or it makes Bill Wilson a suspicious character. The other thing to remember is that as Bill Wilson was writing the big book in sort of 1937, 1938. It was published in 1939, April 1939. But through 1938, as he's writing the big book, Bill Wilson keeps trying to include Dr. Bob Smith, who's in Akron, Ohio. Bill's in New York, Bob's in Akron. He keeps sending Dr. Bob Smith copies of what he's writing. He invites the Akron, Ohio group of the Oxford groups to comment, and very, very little feedback is received from Dr. Bob Smith. Bob Smith and his little group of alcoholics, who were the Oxford group in Akron, were almost opposed to the writing of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. That's because Bob Smith was very, very indoctrinated to the fundamentalist Christian view that the Oxford group, surrender to God, prayer, and forgiveness were enough. So Dr. Bob didn't really participate in the writing of the big book. A guy named Hank Parkhurst did, and that's all explained I'll get it in a few minutes. That's all well explained and researched in a book called Writing the Big Book. One moment. Writing the Big Book by William Schauberg is a very, very important document for people to understand if you're interested in the writing of the big book and the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he goes into a lot of verified and credible detail with footnotes. And in that book, he explains that Bill Wilson wrote the big book without the participation of Bob Smith. So, the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, is published in April 1939. And over the next 5 or 10 years, it gains credibility, it becomes popular, thousands and thousands of copies of the book are being shipped out, all over North America, Canada. And it's to be borne in mind that what Bill Wilson presented was influenced by his youth in the temperance movement, his own sense of shame and guilt at being such a nasty alcoholic, the way that he felt guilty and ashamed of the way that he had behaved in his life, the multiple affairs that he had while he was drinking, and certainly the continuing multiple affairs that he had with women in Alcoholics Anonymous. These are well researched and well known. Very few people in AA want to talk about this because it tends to tarnish the reputation. But in fact, all of these things influenced Bill Wilson when he was writing the book. And what he presented to us was a very specific religious point of view that recovery had to be with a Christian God. It was religious in its focus. God was necessary in your recovery, which is outlined in the over 200 references to God in the big book, and specifically the chapter to agnostics in the big book, which says very specifically that if you're an atheist or an agnostic, your time in recovery will be limited. And if you pray hard enough and you pray long enough, then somehow or other God will manifest in your life and you'll become a believer, and then you're going to be okay. And he makes the psychological error of saying in the book that kind of grandiose. And he says, well, everybody knows that deep down inside the mind of every person lurks the truth of God or the existence of God. And that was an evangelical position that was taken by Protestant Christians, that at heart and in our secret darkest corners of our mind, God exists. And all we have to do is pray hard enough and pray long enough and quit being belligerent and quit arguing and just drink the Kool-Aid, and eventually we'll believe in God. And there are lots of psychiatrists and psychologists and people who have studied this at length, myself being one of them, where that is fundamentally not true. And so in the mindset of 1935, 1940, 1945, what the book did, Alcoholics Anonymous, was it gained a lot of credibility. And that credibility was based on the fact, as I said earlier, they presented that God was necessary. They presented a Christian God. And they presented forgiveness as necessary, which was sweet music to the temperance movement, which was largely in charge of the morality of the community. And the thing that was new, like everybody had known, not everybody, but most people had known for years and decades, that alcoholism was an illness or a disease, but nobody had ever presented any path to get out of that sort of mental illness. He presented a path that apparently worked, which is in how it works. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. So the new thing in Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous is he's agreeing with the temperance movement that he's a sinner. He's agreeing with the medical authorities that he has a disease and a mental obsession or a compulsion. And he's presenting this newfangled way called the 12 steps in order to recover from this moral failure and disease and illness. And this gets a lot of social approval. Now, I'm at the end of my time for this video. It's important to remember that although it was effective in the 1940s and 50s, because of drastic changes in society that happened from the 1960s on, what's presented in Alcoholics Anonymous is becoming more and more less effective. And I will explain why that's happening. So thank you for toughing it out this long, and I look forward to talking to you in the next seminar, the next video. Bye for now.